Thank you so much. I've got no pressure there, obviously, with the calibre of a speaker's comment. It is honestly a pleasure to be speaking to you tonight. Those of you who know me will know I could talk about this for several days, really, without drawing breath. I've worked in this arena since about 2006 when I was over in the USA. And despite it going a bit quiet about 5 years ago, there is no doubt that sustainability, net zero, carbon footprints, greenhouse gas emissions are things that we all have to continue to think about, no matter where we are in the livestock industry. And perhaps it'll be come as no surprise that I firmly believe that cows are not killing the planet and that there is a place for ruminant livestock, both in the British system, but also across the world as well. But I am going to focus mainly on Great Britain and Northern Ireland tonight, rather than looking further overseas. So I'm going to have to crack on, because honestly, as I say, I could talk about this forever without drawing breath. So with no further ado, a bit of a quiz almost, but I wonder if anybody knows what's special about this particular circle. I suspect some of you know. Go on, any ideas? Yep, absolutely. So even at this moment right now, there are more people in that circle than there are in the entire rest of the world. And I saw this data a couple of years ago, and honestly, I didn't believe it. I thought that isn't even possible, but I've checked it year on year on year, and there are more people in that circle than anywhere else. And that's only going to get increasingly important moving forwards, because by the year 2050, we're going to need somewhere between 50 and 60% more food to feed everybody on the planet. We're going to see disproportionate increases and demand for animal source foods in China, in India, in areas of Africa, and all of us within the livestock industry have got a heck of a job to do, frankly, in supplying food to both the national and the global population while reducing environmental impact, maintaining economic profitability, and satisfying social acceptability as well. And it really is my belief, and these are just various pictures of various of the farms that I've visited over time, from sheep near to me, near the White Horse in Oxfordshire, to Jersey cows all the way over in New Zealand, that there's no one definitive sustainable system. What is sustainable, and I define that as a balance between economic viability, environmental responsibility, and social acceptability, changes every single day. You know, we only need to look at the changes that we've seen with Brexit, with the war in the Ukraine, with changes in animal health, with avian flu, for example, and the recent outbreak of blue tongue, to see that our challenges vary every single day. So we may think that at any point we've sort of cracked it and gone, yes, I am now finally sustainable, but tomorrow it may be a very different story. So we've always got different challenges, we've always got different opportunities, but any system can and should be sustainable if we do manage to balance those three things: the economic, the social, and the environmental as well. But of course, at the moment, the focus is very much on net zero, on greenhouse gas emissions, and on carbon footprints. And I love this cartoon because I think it exemplifies the things that we see, particularly in the media all the time. So we're focusing on energy, we're focusing on efficiency, some people are focusing on dietary change that I'll come into in the last bit of my presentation. But one of the questions I have, which is somewhat counterintuitive given the banners and the reports that we have, is should we only think about carbon? Should we only think about net zero? So my point of my talk this evening is both to give some answers and some talking points, but hopefully to give some data and some information and some thoughts about when we have those random conversations with people, many of whom are outside agriculture, you know, what should we or could we be talking about beyond the classic, well, we know that we're doing a good job, so, you know, let's just move on to talking about something more pleasant. And we have to face it, and those of you who know me will know I'm a huge data nerd, but I'm also quite OCD about my slides. This was a slide that I put together first in the States. So you'll see that the foods here go from A for apple at the top left to Z for zucchini at the bottom right. But all foods have some environmental impact. You know, even if we go really extreme and forage and eat, roadkill, as it were, there's still some environmental impact of everything that we eat, and indeed everything that we do every single day. And to pretend otherwise would be slightly disingenuous, I think, because all of these have some impact on biodiversity, on water, on air quality. All of the metrics are represented. So I think my biggest message to all of us, and part of this came out of a conversation I had with a good friend at the Oxford Farming Conference a couple of weeks ago, is we need to be more honest. And if we take lessons, for example, with the experiences of the livestock industry with antibiotic use, we have to be honest. Beef production, sheep production, dairy production, all of those do have an environmental impact. They do have a carbon footprint. We can't pretend otherwise. You can't go into every conversation going, yeah, but, yes, we have an impact. But as an industry, we know what the impact is. We're doing things every day to better quantify that and to better assess how we can bring that impact down. And at Harper Adams and at the School of Sustainable Food and Farming, we have some large-scale projects on at the moment to fully understand and investigate exactly how we do that on every single different farm. And so, yes, we have an impact. Yes, we're doing everything that we can to cut that, and we're going to continue to do that in future. It isn't about, well, we've always done this, so we'll just keep doing it. We've got to be more honest. And if we're honest and transparent with the consumer, the processor, the policymaker, our messages will resonate better, and we can have more productive conversations. Now, having said that, I'm sure you've all seen this graphic or one very like it in the past. This is some work based on a paper by Poor and Nemeczek from Oxford University. This particular one is, as it's quoted in the BBC, it's been quoted an awful lot during the various COP summits. It is a scientific paper. It's published in Nature. If you mention it on Twitter, you're going to get, shot down within about 5 minutes, because generally speaking, people in the livestock industry hate this paper with a passion. And we can understand why, because you probably can't see it, but right at the bottom down here, it says the figures for each food are based on calculations from 119 different countries. And yet we have one figure for pork, for beef, for prawns, for chocolate. So it's understandable that being presented with this graph, people go, but that doesn't represent me in Oxfordshire or in Somerset or in Lanarkshire. This is a very global paper which is often used to represent the British livestock industry. Now, interestingly, I do have a meeting with Joseph Poor at the University of Oxford tomorrow morning, so it's going to be very interesting to see how that goes. I'll keep you posted. But we've got to be more representative of our industry in the UK. But again, in an honest, transparent way. Not, of course we're better than this. This is nonsense. But simply, this is where we fit. So in this example, Poor and Nemeczek say that beef greenhouse gas emissions go from between 4 to 15 kilos of beef per serving, and I should emphasize per serving, so that isn't per kilo, it's per 100 to 200 grams, not per kilo. But again, is this the whole picture? Is this the only thing we should be focusing on as an industry? Well, globally, and this is relatively old data now, came out from the FAO, globally came out in 2013 now, so 11 years ago, there's a huge amount of variation all the way across the world. So you can see the global average on the right, 47 kilos of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilo of dead weight. But we would be placed in Western Europe at about 18, and the highest numbers, as you can see, for Latin America and South Asia at 73 and 75 kilos of carbon per kilo of dead weight. So again, data from 119 countries being used to represent a British agriculture is a bit of a problem, because that 47 figure doesn't really represent anywhere with, roughly the exception of East and Southeast Asia. So we cannot apply global figures to regional agricultural systems. This, again, another infographic, this one from Instagram. I sort of love it and I hate it, this one. It's so beautifully done. You know, it's this cool little cartoon. You've got the various foods there. The sides of the gas clouds from each food is the carbon footprint of that food. As a scientist, I loathe it with a passion because there's no citation there. I've got no idea where this data comes from. You know, is it true? Is it false? I've got no idea whatsoever. It also shows kilos of carbon per 1,000 calories. If we're looking at beef, if we're looking at dairy, if we're looking at pork or prawns or cheese, we're not eating those foods for calories. We're eating them for high quality protein, vitamins, minerals, etc. It's not about calories. So we've got to get better metrics, more representative metrics. And that isn't to sort of cheat the system. As I say, we've got to be honest, but part of honesty is using the right metrics. So, for example, kilos of protein, kilos of human digestible protein, kilos of available amino acids, for example. And there's more and more work going on. Professor Michael Lee at Harper Adams, for example, recently put out a really nice paper looking at different ruminant systems on the basis of the nutritional contents of those foods. So it isn't just about being honest, it's about having the right metrics as well. And that will change over time. Again, I love this infographic because it's basically London, isn't it? You know, we've got better and better now. We all walk along looking at our phones like this, you know. But climate science does change. It changes over time because we know more and we know better. So there is no doubt that the implementation of carbon sequestration into the carbon tools and the adoption, hopefully, perhaps at some point, of the new global warming metric, global warming potential star, should bring down our ruminant carbon footprints compared to other foods. But again, we will still have a carbon footprint, and I believe we've got to do everything we can as an industry, not just to demonstrate that we understand our footprint, that we're doing everything we can to cut it and everything we can possibly do to mitigate that impact on the environment. So a little bit of myth busting very briefly. As I say, everything evolves, everything changes. And the thing that I get tasked with most often, particularly from someone who's really angry about being told they have to assess their carbon, is, well, what about the bison? You know, there were bison in the States, then they killed them all. Those bison had a big carbon footprint. Unfortunately for them, I am the biggest data nerd known to mankind. And actually, in a paper that I published several years ago now, I actually calculated the methane emissions from the bison population in the States before mass extermination in the late 18th, 19th century, 19th century, compared to the 2007 US dairy industry. So yes, they had a big impact. You know, their methane emissions were double that of the 2007 US dairy industry. But they were around when we didn't have cars, we didn't have trains, we didn't have iPads, we didn't have all of the things that we do now. So yes, they had a really big impact back in the world where we didn't use electricity, for example. But again, things have changed, things have evolved. We can't just keep going, yeah, but the bison, so cattle get a free pass. You know, we've got to put things in context and we've got to accept that the science moves on. And we really need to be realistic about what we can do on every single farm, because every farm is different. At Harper at the moment, we're doing some really interesting work with ABP, carbon footprinting 350 beef and lamb farms across Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And there's so much variation, and it's really interesting because you can see 3 farms that at a superficial level you think should be all the same, and they vary so much in terms of the system, the practices, the cattle, the key performance indicators, the carbon footprint. So we've got to accept that what's an opportunity on a Highland cattle farm in the Highlands of Scotland is not the same as a stabiliser operation in Yorkshire or even a finishing operation in Shropshire, and if anybody at the end can tell me what these cattle are crossed with, they get a prize. Yes, it's a Belgian Blue, but they're crossed with something that you would perhaps not expect, but we won't waste time on it now, but if you can tell me at the end, I will think of a prize. So every operation and every farm and every system has different opportunities, but identifying them is really, really, really key. So it's really important to understand on every farm, what can we do? How should we do it? And we don't know all the answers yet. Honestly, I would love to say we know exactly what we can do with carbon, with biodiversity, with water, with air, you know, job done. We don't know all the answers yet, and we've got to be honest about that again. But the more science, the more information, the more data we've got, the more we can learn what our opportunities are and what we can do going forwards. So we've got to exemplify the best farms. So many of you will know Ian Norbury up in Knutsford in Cheshire. You know, he's doing some really interesting things with overwintering based on grazing pails out in the field. You know, we've got to look at the best farmers. And every meeting I go to, people say, well, there's the bottom 10%, and if we just got rid of them, you know, job done. Well, let's not look at it that way. Let's look at the best. What are the best farmers doing? What makes them have a lower carbon footprint? What makes them have really good key performance indicators? And how can that be applied to every other farm and every other system? And then we can make far more progress. So is it all about carbon? Well, I don't think it is. It is from a policymaker point of view at the moment, but we've got so many other opportunities and so many other talking points, particularly with the consumer. And I have a tendency to get into arguments with some of my friends. I have a fellow rugby coach, and she's great. She's a lovely, lovely person. She's vegetarian, and she can be quite shouty about the fact that she's vegetarian, quite honestly. I love her to bits, but we've had some interesting conversations. And one of the most recent one was, well, we use all this land for animals, you know, if we just grew corn and things instead, you know, no problem. And she's brilliant and she's really clever, but trying to understand the whole of agriculture, you know, when we're having this conversation at a station on the way to Twickenham, you know, is a pretty difficult thing to do. But I tried anyway. So we see these infographics, you know, all the time. If we just didn't eat meat, if we grew corn and quinoa and apples instead, you know, problem solved, climate sorted. Well, that's often based on feed efficiency. And if you read The Guardian, I believe some people do read The Guardian, if you read The Guardian, one of the main things they'll often say is, well, if you're going to eat meat, you should eat pork and poultry. You know, you shouldn't eat beef and lamb because of the differences in feed efficiency. Well, when we look at feed efficiency, obviously from a traditional basis, so kilos of feed going in compared to kilos of output coming out, we do see that suckler beef, for example, looks pretty rubbish, frankly. This was some really interesting work done by Mike Wilkinson, came out in 2011. UK based, so we're looking at dairy, suckler beef, cereal beef, pork, poultry and eggs. And you can clearly see that on a traditional feed efficiency basis, you know, pork, poultry and eggs beat suckler beef. You know, it makes perfect sense. The problem is it's not that simple, is it? It isn't, it's far more nuanced and complex than that. Because if we look at the proportion of the feeds that we feed to livestock that are human edible, i.e. the yellowy orange bits of the bars, compared to non-human edible, the green bits, grass, fairly obviously, non-human edible. Most of oilseed meals and other byproducts, non-human edible. So if we take all of that into account when we look at feed efficiency, so we don't just go feed in milk, meat or eggs out, we go human edible feed versus human edible milk, meat or eggs, either on an energy or protein basis coming out, this is the protein one, we see a very different picture. Because both dairy and suckler beef, because of the proportion of forage that is used in those animals to produce that beef or dairy, actually put out more human edible protein than they ever consume. So there is basically no feed versus food competition when we're looking at dairy and suckler beef. And even for cereal beef, which on the earlier slide had a feed efficiency of about 7.6, here you can see it's far closer to pork, poultry and eggs than it was before. Now, this is not to throw pork, poultry and eggs under the bus, not at all. You know, it's simply that the message is more complex than just feed versus food or feed in, food out. So we've got to think about it on a more complex basis. And I know that we all know this, but to so many people, you know, well, we can grow food everywhere, can't we? Well, this was, we were on holiday in Scotland about 5 years ago now. You know, it would be nice to think that we can grow everything everywhere, but we can't. You know, it's too dry, it's too wet, it's too hilly, it's underwater, like most of Oxfordshire at the moment. You know, we can't grow human food on every acre of land. But to many consumers, land is land. You know, you can grow things anywhere in the world. It's that simple. And being able to explain that can be really, really, really tricky. We know, for example, that in the UK, 65% of our land can't be effectively used for anything but grassland. And honestly, again, I always thought that that figure was complete nonsense until I looked at the DEFRA data and I went, yeah, absolutely right. So 2/3 of our land in the UK can't be used for anything else. So again, Mike Wilkinson, but also Michael Lee at Harper Adams put together this work. This time we're not just looking at feed, we're looking at land use. So again, we've got milk, we've got upland beef and lamb, we've got cereal beef, pork, poultry and eggs. And this is total land use per tonne of protein. And again, ruminant livestock look pretty rubbish, don't they, frankly, because it takes so much land to feed a suckler cow. But that's not because she eats so much, it's just because it's based on forage. So if we break that down into grassland versus arable land, we see a pretty different picture. And when we consider that most of that grassland can't be used for anything else, and if we just look at the arable land instead, all of a sudden we see a very different picture. Again, not here to throw pork and poultry under the bus, not at all. But if we're looking at arable land use, we can see that milk, upland lamb, lowland lamb, upland beef and lamb use far less arable land per tonne of protein than pork and poultry. And there is honestly a place for every single system. There's a place for pork, there's a place for poultry, beef, lamb, goats, dairy, you know, there is a place for everybody. It's about making the best use of that land. And for so much land in the UK, the best use, or perhaps even the only use in terms of human food, is to put grazing livestock on that land. Now, interestingly, again, I often hear from some of my friends, well, if we just took the cattle off, even if we can't grow food on that land, it'll be great for the birds. And I think they have this sort of Disney image where they're all going to sort of tweet about with little stars, you know, everything will be perfect, the birds will come back to the land and everything will be wonderful. Well, this was tried in the Highlands of Scotland in the 80s and 90s. So the incentive was to try to improve the land. We're going to plant trees. You know, everyone knows birds love trees. Everything's good. Unless you're a ground nesting bird. Ground nesting birds don't like trees. There's a really interesting thesis from the University of Durham, I believe it is, where they looked what happened when you had ground nesting birds and new plantations of trees. And ground nesting birds associate trees with predators. So if you plant trees, the ground nesting birds go, oh no, those are full of, I don't know, cats and hawks, for example. The ground nesting birds go away. If we take the cattle off the land as well, fairly obviously we don't have any dung. And if we've got no dung going into the ground, we suddenly have the magnificent creature, dung beetles. Dung beetles, far more people can talk about these for many hours than I can, but they are magnificent creatures. But in this context, not only do they take the dung, incorporate it into the soil, improve the soil health, the soil carbon, the soil fertility, they also lay larvae which feed the ground nesting birds. So if we take the cattle off, we don't have the dung to feed the dung beetles which feed the ground nesting birds. If we take the cattle off, the grass always often grows, obviously. And as the grass grows higher and higher and higher and becomes higher than 10 to 15 centimetres, the ground nesting birds go, well, that's too high now. I can't nest here now. So the combination of this is if we take the cattle off and the sheep off with the premise that this will be better for birds, the birds actually go, this doesn't suit me anymore. My ecosystem, which was entirely dependent on those cattle, has been destroyed. So it isn't as simple as take all the livestock off and all the biodiversity will come flooding back. It's an ecosystem for a reason that has been developed over centuries, and we've got to take that into consideration. There is some really interesting work, and I don't have the reference on the slide, but there is some economic work that states that dung beetles in the UK save farmers £367 million per year. I mean, amazingly valuable. And of course, with soil, ultimately, almost all of our food comes from the soil. And I say almost because the picture in the middle row on the right-hand side is a fish pie. But even the fish is of course, affected by what we do with the soil in terms of inputs, in terms of erosion. So we really have to do everything we can to preserve soil health, soil fertility, soil quality going forward. So I was having a really interesting conversation on the way here with David, and we were talking about putting livestock back into arable systems. And that, I think, is going to be really key going forwards, given the price of fertiliser, the concerns over inputs. If we can have a better integration of livestock into every arable system, I think we'll be far better placed now and in the future. So finally, a tiny bit more myth-busting. It is January, of course, so we are in Veganuary. Except, to be honest, I don't know about you guys, but it feels like it's gone very quiet this year. It's been quite loud in the past. Some of you will know that I had a bit of a reputation for arguing with people on Twitter about 5 years ago now. It's really, this year particularly, seems to be really quiet. I'm not seeing all the traffic about go plant-based this year, try this. And as with any system potentially being sustainable, I honestly believe any diet is okay. It's absolutely your choice. You want to be vegetarian, you want to be vegan, pescatarian, fruitarian, whatever you want to eat, that's entirely your choice. Not necessarily my choice, but absolutely your choice. But every year in January we have Veganuary, and last year they hit a high of 706,965 participants. As I say, last year this was all over the media, go vegan this year, job done, everything's good. So let's just put those numbers into context, because I think one of the issues we often have is we see big numbers, but there's no context for it. How big is that big number? 706,000 people is roughly twice the population of Coventry. I mean, Coventry's great, but it's not the biggest city in the world, is it? It isn't New York, it isn't LA, it isn't Beijing, it's Coventry. And if all of those people were based in the UK rather than all across the world, they'd be equal to about 1% of the population. This is not global, large-scale change. On average, per participating country, it's 3,663 people, and interestingly, 60% of the participants who undertake Veganuary are already vegan, vegetarian, or pescatarian. So with the best will in the world, if you're vegan and you do Veganuary, that's a bit like me doing cheeseuary. I mean, that's just what I do. I eat a lot of cheese. If I'm vegan and I go vegan, I'm still vegan. Nothing's changing. So I guess the sort of positive message for this, for the livestock industry, is yes, I honestly think it's great that there are more plant-based options. I properly love it that my daughter, who will be 10 next week, often chooses the vegetarian option at school. I think dietary diversity is a wonderful thing, but the world isn't going vegan overnight. There is a trend. It's been very cool in the past, but particularly this year, it really seems to have died down an awful lot. This is some data that came out back in 2019 now. We're seeing the same trend still. Most people are still eating meat and or fish. 3% vegetarian, 1% vegan, but in this survey, which came out from YouGov, 15% flexitarian. And there I think we have an opportunity as a livestock industry, because it's about making a more conscious choice. If we take the British Veterinary Association tag, it's eat less but better. And if better means higher quality meat, local butchers, knowing where your food comes from, not just buying on price, but going, maybe I should get the better quality, chicken or pork or beef, rather than just the cheapest every single time. And for British agriculture sort of PLC, as it were, if that means more domestic food, fewer imports. That may be a real positive. So I think we can take this as an opportunity, cliche though it is, rather than a threat. You know, we have an opportunity to talk to those people who are more concerned about their food system and their food choices than they perhaps were in the past. So again, finally, to put a couple of things in context, again, this came out just before COVID, basically, came out in 2020. And this was the first paper, came out from the Centre for Research Energy Demand Solutions. And it was the first paper to look at all the papers out there and use a meta-analysis to examine the impacts of individual people's choices. And what this showed, as you can see, that the top 6, living car-free, having a battery car, flying less, using public transport, don't include diets at all. And again, that's very different to what we see in the media all the time, where almost always says, the biggest thing you can do for the planet, give up meat. The science appears to show something else. Now, as I say, please don't take that as, we don't need to do anything because cars are the problem. That is not my message. We've got to be honest, we've got to be transparent, we've got to do everything we can to cut carbon emissions to improve environmental impacts. There's no doubt about that. But it's got to be put in context for people. So lastly, with the interest of putting it into context, I've flown an awful lot less in the last 4 or 5 years, not least, obviously, because of COVID. But during COVID, someone said to me, well, how much do flights actually cost in terms of carbon? And I said, I'm a data nerd. Let's not just look at it in carbon. Let's look at how much beef we could eat instead. And I'm not going to lie, sometimes I don't fly places because I just don't fancy doing that talk, but I will then eat some beef. So if we're going to fly from London Heathrow to Mallorca, Lanzarote, New York, Cape Town or Sydney, we know there's a carbon footprint per person associated with those flights. So these are per passenger return flights. So not surprisingly, perhaps, if we fly to Lanzarote, that's about 1,100 kilos of carbon per passenger. If we fly to Sydney, that's over 6,000. The further the flight, the higher the carbon footprint. Interestingly, if you have the potential to fly first class, your carbon footprint's even higher because there are fewer first class passengers on the plane than everybody else. That's my excuse for just being cheap, I think. But the last conference that I did before COVID hit, so back in 2020 now, was when I flew to Sydney in Australia in February 2020. So that would have cost me over 6,000 kilos of carbon. If I had not done that, and I had instead done the talk on Teams or Zoom or all of the platforms, I could have saved all that carbon or instead eaten 172 kilos of beef, which in context for the average person is 9.5 years worth of beef consumption. So, I'm not saying we shouldn't fly and we should eat beef, but we've got to put things into context. We've got to help people understand if you're only going to do A or B, if you're going to go vegan for the planet and then go on holiday 5 times a year via plane, you probably haven't got that much of a trade-off going on. We've got to have that context and we've got to have, as I say, that honesty and transparency. So with that, every food we eat, everything we do, every farming system has some environmental impact. It is disingenuous to say, no, we're good, everything we do is just wiped out because we graze our cattle or because of carbon sequestration. Everything we do has an impact. But when we look at the impacts in Britain, we've got to look at regional data. If we look at global averages, that doesn't represent anybody. When we look at feed efficiency and food, there is very little competition between dairy and grazing beef with feed versus food. Other systems, yes, but we can improve that again. And grazing ruminants, particularly cattle, give us really important ecosystem services, landscape services. And lastly, I do need to underline, everybody's food choices are valid. I'm never going to argue that you should eat meat or you must eat cheese. I think we should all have that choice. Let's just not try to preach it necessarily onto other people. My choices are my choices and everybody else's choices are theirs. So very happy to answer questions. If we have any time, you have my email address there at Harper Adams. And again, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.